in 1937, as far as I was concerned, it was sort of the beginning of a very interesting period. Having been through the Depression myself, and knowing how difficult it was, although it was never the way so many people were suffering, I had been hired by Life magazine when it started. So it was quite relatively easy, the easiest period in my life so far. And I was in San Francisco, and when Life started out, they asked me to be a staff photographer, which nobody realized how glorious or important it was. But I was excited and very, very happy about the opportunity, because it meant doing something that had never exactly been done before in the way of journalistic photography. It was actually the epitome of what I would want to do. And looking back on it, now it was still a great period, because with the people that I was working with and the acceptance of the magazine, I could go anywhere and be reasonably welcome. But the main thing that I know you're interested in is the fact that the 37s were not a glorious time. We were just, for many people, we were just emerging from and slowly from a very, very tough time. And so when I went out with, as not as an assignment, but I went out with Dorothea Lange, who was a very famous photographer, and her professor husband, and saw the conditions under which the migratory laborers were working. I was surprised and shocked, because even as a Californian, I wasn't aware of that aspect of how close to the margin everybody was. And when it came at this time, it was a very rainy year, and these people weren't close to the margin; they were over the margin with the floods and all these circumstances. The thing that took me down there at first was the actual news happenings of lettuce strikes, when it was quite, for me at least, quite a violent experience. I mean, with the hired, well, you can call them strike breakers or goons, as they were referred to, who were armed with pickaxes to either beat or threaten to beat these workers into accepting non-living wages. And not only that, but I was quite shocked to see that our California police highway patrol was used as strike breakers as well, and with large amounts of tear gas to subdue. They weren't riots, but at least they intimidated the strikers, and I was. I expected a certain amount of difficulty for. I was a young man, but fairly strong. But Dorothea Lange was a not so young, and small, and somewhat handicapped, we call it nowadays, from early polio. And the way she stood up to these very burly deputy sheriffs, and as they were sworn in, so they did this all under the auspices of legality. But the way she stood up to them just amazed me, and I remember that one of my greatest memories is this little woman standing up to the police. But I realized that it was a great story, I thought, and so I asked Life magazine if they wouldn't like to do a story on these migratory laborers. We call them migratory laborers. The term Okie was used disparagingly about them, and we just, particularly when we refer to them themselves, we just use the term migratory laborers. The fact that it was that the weather was so really bad compounded their problems. In the first place, they came out there sort of lured by the flyers that were sent out telling of sunny California and wonderful jobs that were waiting for them. And when they actually crossed the border, they found that they were in a place that had no jobs and was beginning to be partially underwater, no work of any kind. So this was a terribly discouraging situation. We call them now Okies, and they did come from Oklahoma, but they came from Arkansas and maybe northern Texas, wherever they'd been dispossessed by circumstances, that is, the Dust Bowl. Actually, we also referred to it as the Dust Bowl. But it wasn't the Dust Bowl alone, it was the fact that these people were mostly small, independent farmers. Some of them were sharecroppers, but most of them had their own small farms. And when they couldn't make any living off of it, the banks foreclosed, and they just didn't have any place anymore. But with the attraction, allurement of wonderful jobs in California, they came out expecting to confidently to find work. It wasn't that they were just wandering. They had the expectation, which was that of jobs were there, and this was rather unfair, but it did bring the prices down for what labor there was, because people would work for anything. There were no signs we'll work for food, because there was no use. There was just no work, and I wanted to do a story. This was not a story such as you now see in Somaliland, because these people were all relatively healthy. They were hungry. They weren't starving, and but they were on the borderline of all the time. And so when I suggested to the editors in Life that we ought to do a story, I think I probably sent a picture or two to give them an idea. And of course, it was very discouraging. These weren't happy people, and Life was not interested in doing a story of this type at that time. As when I sent the things and asked them, they said, "Well, Life makes its street sales comes from pretty girls on the cover." And he said, "Nobody wants to look at tired, frightened Americans." So then I went to Fortune magazine, which is a sister publication of Life, but it was at that time called the Red Corner of Time Inc. And they were a lot more sympathetic, and so the editors were delighted with the idea of doing a story, I should say that first that I was wanted to do a story by myself, as I usually operated. But when I saw that they didn't want a story, Life turned it down as a story for me. So I decided, well, I had seen a book that Margaret Bourcoit, who was also a Life photographer, and I thought if she can do a book, they can't complain about my doing a book on my own. So she had worked with an author, Erskine Caldwell, and so I thought, well, I have to get somebody, another author, similar ability, to work, to collaborate with me. So, being in San Francisco, I thought of John Steinbeck, who had also done a book called In Dubious Battle on agricultural problems, and it seemed very sympathetic. So I picked up the phone and called him and asked him, would you be interested in doing a photographic book on migratory labor? And he was very willing to do it, and asked me to come down and talk to him and to his wife about the project. And so I drove down to Los Gatos, which is south of San Francisco, and we had lunch there and leisurely talk about it. It wasn't a big problem. I mean, just a way of how we could work it out. He was editing, I think, the Grapes of Wrath. So during the week he didn't have any time, and since I worked for Life, I didn't have any time either. But I felt that the weekends were legitimately mine to do as I chose. So we decided to go down every weekend and start interviewing the various people who were in not so much in organized camps or groups, but who were scattered along the roadside, living, some of them in the car itself, or in ragged tents of stretches of canvas even on the wet soil or grass. At any rate, it gave us this way. We could move. We didn't have to be too much disturbed. I mean, we worked with individual families. We would go down on the weekend, which meant that since I lived in San Francisco, I'd go down to the nearest Safeway and fill up my station wagon with all the cheapest cuts of meat and the bulk things that were filling but not expensive, and even day-old bread and the such things as old wilted vegetables that the market probably couldn't sell anyway, and so they were at a bargain, and made a very healthy sort of a mixture anyway. And the purpose for these things were not in any way a bribe or a gift. These were a method that we felt that could sort of not just show our interest in them, but we would ask them sort of to cook it for us and make it look as if that they were doing us a favor. And these were very proud people. That's one thing that I can't overemphasize. These were independent, very, I would say, religious, God-fearing people who weren't looking for any charity. And of course, there there was no such thing as welfare or relief. There was statewide relief, but they found out that they weren't eligible because they hadn't lived any place in California for a year, which I think was a necessity. But at any rate, they were looking for jobs. And by our coming there and trying to become part of the family when we interview, they could accept us. I never found any semblance of resentment as why I was poking a camera in their face and taking their pictures. Of course, I really sort of followed behind Steinbeck. He interviewed the people. He talked to them. And I just happened to be there taking pictures. And they accepted this with never a question as far as I could see. And I think the pictures sort of show the fact that these people, don't want to say they were relaxed, but at least they were not posing. They were just being themselves. And of course, they're sad pictures in many ways. My wife says, "Oh, they're lovely pictures. But I don't want to have any of them up in my room because they are so discouraged." I always felt that these people had reached the point that they were truly had been, life had just beaten them down, and they accepted whatever demands, for example, that I would make taking pictures without any question. That was a great education for me. I had always lived in rural, sort of farm communities. My family has been ranchers, and I realized that we didn't have much understanding or sympathy for these people who actually came to California and were a part of the whole system of California agricultural wealth. I mean, the term migratory labor is very apt because they were Mexicans originally, and they would come up either from Mexico or from Imperial Valley and have a regular path that they would go every year, migrating, if you want to call it that, up to finishing up with the apples up in Washington State. I mean, through oranges, through the lettuce, the oranges, the various what they call stoop crops, because they had to stoop to pick them or cultivate them, and then ending with the fruit in up in the Yakima Valley. So and then they would come back and wait to the cycle to start all over again the next year. But all this had changed with these people, these Americans, Anglos, or call them whatever you want, who came out from Oklahoma, because they were not looking for a pattern job. They were looking for a job, anything, a permanent job if possible, because at that time they assumed that nobody was ever going to go back to the Dust Bowl. And so they were quite a different, in quite different circumstances. The state wasn't at all prepared for them or this problem. As a matter of fact, the people who had benefited most from the migratory labors themselves were very resentful of the fact that here were people who were sort of really looking for permanence. It was much easier to deal with people who were here today and gone tomorrow, and you didn't have any responsibility for them, and who were in a position where they couldn't really demand anything in the way of consideration or wages or health or even elementary sanitation. The farmers just felt no responsibility for them at all. And the farmers in California, I don't know whether this was a concerted attempt or whether they actually realized what the situation was, but they didn't want any responsibility for these people. And I was starting to tell you about how the farm resettlement was trying to make American people aware of the problem. And the photographers such as Dorothea Lange and Karl Maidans and others really helped. It was a form of propaganda, rather, maybe a negative propaganda, but it helped to make Americans of that generation, at least, somewhat aware of the problem. And in this they served, I think, an important position. And of course, when ultimately when Steinbeck wrote *The Grapes of Wrath*, it was a very seminal sort of beginning of the understanding of the problem, and therefore extremely important to the American people. Actually, I don't think that the people that we photographed really benefited very much, but the awareness of the American people has improved a great deal, and I think that Steinbeck's book *The Grapes of Wrath* and the movie played a very great part in this. Of course, this was the use of the book in the movie was very important, because I run across lots of people who haven't read *The Grapes of Wrath*, but they've seen *The Grapes of Wrath*. And fortunately, since 20th Century Fox used some of my pictures as, giving some information for casting. I don't know how important it was, but some of the people that ended up in the movies were actually dead ringers for the people that Steinbeck and I photographed and talked with. So I think that the modern generation is at least a little aware of what things were like, which was not the case in 1937. It was very slow. It didn't, and in the 37s, it wasn't true. I personally didn't aware that how impressed I was until retroactively looking back. I realized that it made me a lot more sympathetic and understanding for these people. The worst, they weren't sleeping on without any covering, but they were sleeping with just ragged piece of canvas or cloth to actually break the rain. They were wet, and the grass or the dirt was wet. Some of them would build their tents or raise their tents, if they had any, underneath the concrete roadway culverts, which meant that they had a perfect protection from overhead rain. But when the streams began to build up, it had its own dangers. Of course, that they would have to move. I don't think anybody was washed out by the rains, but then they had no steady form of obtaining food. They had no money to buy food, and there were no stores for them to buy food, and no provision to provide. Actually, the American communities were individually charitable people, but this was just overwhelming, and they rather ignored there were individual people who would try to do something, but it was a little bit too big to undertake as personal charity. I mean, I'm sure the churches did what they could, and individuals did what they could, but there was general, I think, the tendency to ignore the whole situation, just sweep it under the rug so that you didn't think about it. Steinbeck did tell the story of how some of the families were living in 24 families to a boxcar, which was provided by the individual farmers in this particular case. And then watch the rain and the floods come up inch by inch. These box cars had become just inundated, so that the water was maybe a foot or so had overrun the floor of it, and the washing was hanging out to dry over just not roaring fields of water, but just gently running fields of water. It wasn't the kind of flood that washed out things. It just was water permeated every place. And of course, when it became sort of general, there was not so much place for these people to move to. I mean, they always moved to higher ground, but all of them were sort of road bound in the sense that everybody had to have some form of transportation, because there was no public transportation. If they wanted to go any place in search of a job, they had to have a broken down jalopy, they called it, where that people kept running some way or other with baling wire or rags or to keep the gasoline, which was they would buy by the gallon. But it was very important to them to have this. But they were sad-looking vehicles. That was a difficult thing, I'm sure, for Steinbeck, and certainly was for me. The sense that we would go down the night before to be there in the early morning to start working on Saturday, and naturally we stayed in motels. Weren't luxurious as they can be now. They were just the cheapest form of place to sleep, but they were warm and relatively comfortable, and they all had coffee shops where we could get nice hot breakfast, and so we would early in the morning have our breakfast there, and coming out of a warm situation, start working with people who were shivering, who had nothing, no food, and it was a sort of shameful situation for us, because you couldn't. I mean, if we'd been hungry too, and I think we kind of felt we should be hungry, in order to really have great empathy with these people. But naturally, I mean, life does go on. Nobody talked politics to them. Nobody talked about the government. They didn't feel that they didn't express any feeling that they were entitled to anything. They sort of thought the way I felt that it. I mean, they themselves felt. I didn't feel it, but they thought this is just an act of God that has put them in this position, and they weren't really about to feel that that anything was owed them at all. They did feel a little resentment about that they were some attempt to mislead them as to working conditions, and was made on the part of somebody, and that was the growers. And this was really shameful. But in general, perhaps I should explain that in 1937, about that time, well, earlier, of course, it developed, but it was fairly strong, feeling that there was something missing, something wrong with the system that allowed this sort of thing just to be accepted. And a lot of talk about Steinbeck being a communist and whatnot, and the sort of agitation against Steinbeck, even in his own home town, as being a communist, I felt was very unfair. I don't know whether he was a communist, and frankly, I didn't care whether he was a communist. But he had so much sympathy for the underdog in the system that he, like so many intellectuals, well, I kind of would like to say thinking people, felt this shouldn't be. And so he was, he didn't talk politics to me at all. Well, naturally, we couldn't go and be with these people without talking a little bit and being not just shocked, but sympathetic. That was the main thing. I mean, it was not the kind of thing that you were shocked about, because you sort of accepted that this existed. There was no use being shocked about it. But couldn't help but feel that somehow or other, fundamentally, this was wrong, particularly in a country as rich as America was at the time. In general, I felt that the local people, farmers, and particularly the individual farmers are one thing, but when they grew into associated farmers, would have been very happy if they could have ignored it and pretended that they didn't exist. But since they did exist, they seem to have a great deal of resentment against these people moving in, and just the fact that they did exist. I mean, it wasn't they resented them individually. It was just the fact that why should they sort of destroy the relatively smooth pattern of California life by just being there asking for a job or hoping for a job. And they were not terribly at all aggressive about it, but they were really rather pathetic in their hoping for some sort of work. There was a certain amount of strike activity, which in those days was not at all organized as it became later by Chavez or people like that. It was all sort of more or less spontaneous. When people, for example, when the price per box went down beyond any reason, where it was impossible, no matter how hard you worked, to earn enough to buy any food or any appreciable amount of food. There were some strikes, sort of spontaneous strikes in the Salinas area. And that's where I first ran across it, where the Associated Farmers and the highway patrols and deputy sheriffs and they were the ones who took the aggressive action. See, I don't wish to believe or paint these people as lily white. I don't know, but I mean, I know that they all were unhappy and in not being able to work, and perhaps I idealize them to a certain degree, because I certainly became very sympathetic with their wish for a better life by working for it, not at anybody else's expense. Let me tell about Rosa Sharon, because this is one picture that to me represented, it was a very sympathetic, and I knew photographically a very, well, it expressed a certain mood and situation of a young woman who was nursing a baby, and I thought it was a very sort of Madonna-like a situation with a hand of the husband in the background. And so this happened to be kind of a favorite picture of mine. And so when Steinbeck used the story of this woman in the last few pages of the book, he changed it to her giving her breast to the dying man. And I was unhappy because, one, it hadn't happened, and two, it was not terribly fitting at that time. In 1937, American people were extremely conventional, not the way we are today, and I thought it was put in to really sort of shock and titillate the readers. And when I expressed that opinion to Steinbeck, he was very resentful. In California, of course, or in the West, we were aware that there was a lot of sort of preparation for war. For example, I did a story for Fortune on when they were developing the first, what they call flying fortress up in Seattle, and in general, a lot of preparation and a lot of effort and money was being spent by 47 for what we call preparedness, or it wasn't for war, but we obviously people were worried about the possibilities. And I happened to be driving with my son over a bridge in Washington when the news came that Hitler had invaded Poland, and my son, who was 9 years old at the time, said, "Well, Dad, if that's the way the world is, it's a hell of a world to bring children into," and I agreed with him. And of course, I've agreed many times with children who feel that the older people can't adjust their lives so that we can live in peace, and the only way that the economies develop is when they can count on either defense spending or war spending, as we did later on. Well, we're still facing that now of the hangover from our prosperity here in the West was built on defense spending, and we're feeling the lack of it now. I mean, I think it was such a shocking event when I don't know how many people remember about 1939 when they went in, but it was totally unexpected. I mean, we'd sort of lulled ourselves into the belief that everything was going to be all right, and it was a shock that here we were facing. We weren't facing war actually ourselves, but it was the beginning of war, and of course, when war actually came, I went into the Navy. I was lucky enough to be able to still continue to do stories with a photographer, under a photographer who commissioned, he himself was commissioned, and then commissioned 5 officers to photograph the Navy at war. There was a really the Japanese. I mean, the California or the West has been very racist anyway, beginning with people like William Randolph Hearst, who was my wife's, my mother's employee. She was an editor of a woman's section of a Hearst paper, and Hearst was talking all the time about the Yellow Peril and how Japan was such a danger to America, and so the farmers were aware, in some ways, in a resentful way, of the fact that the Japanese would come and get a small piece of otherwise wasteland and turn it into a truly productive situation, and the farmers were, I don't know whether I should say envious, but they were resentful of the Japanese ability to do that, and they criticized it largely on the basis, well, they said they worked long hours, the wife works, the children work, and of course that happens to be a rather Japanese convention of everybody turning to and working, and it was true. So when war came, California was quite happy to confiscate the land and incarcerate, or whatever you want to call it, the Japanese in internment camps. And by that time, I began to be a little bit understanding and resentful myself of this attitude towards hardworking people who wanted nothing more than just to be allowed to work hard. I didn't believe that the Japanese would be powerful enough to undertake such a thing, because Japan is a very small place with practically no resources, and we're such a big country with every resource, and I couldn't believe that the Japanese would really make war in the United States. And when I went to Japan later on, one of the men that I was quite interested in reading about was an admiral, Japanese admiral by the name of Yamamoto, who said, frankly, he said, this is a great mistake. We're never going to win this war. He'd been an ambassador in Washington, and he knew the power of America. And but I never personally expected to see this happen, or the day that Pearl Harbor occurred. I was in Alaska when Pearl Harbor occurred, and when I finally came down to managed to get back to California, I was I knew that my life as a photographer was going to be very restricted because California, particularly, had almost hysteria about the Japanese landing as they did at Pearl Harbor, and so that any photography that could be considered of strategic objects was forbidden here. And I mean, if you even took a picture of a Golden Gate Bridge, people would say, well, that could be used for spying. And so I was kind of happy to go into the service in the Navy and be able to take pictures that were sort of constructive. My wife I was in the Navy as lieutenant commander for 4 years, and my wife calls me the photographer correspondent who never took pictures of blood or anything like that. I tried to do stories that were constructive about what the Americans were doing and could do, not actually the devastating part of war. Perhaps it's a cop-out on my part, but I felt I could still do a job in a constructive way. At 84, you have a lot of time to think about what we all did wrong, actually. And if we learned anything from this last depression, I hope that it will be in some way conducive to understanding of what we must do in the future. And I feel that for one thing, that television is a very good thing to make particularly young people realize what it was like and what it shouldn't be like in the future. So I'm very grateful for having gone through these years and learning something. I mean, unfortunately, nobody can learn except by experience. I mean, textbooks and all that don't help too much. Sometimes I think television is going to help people. I feel that we all should be aware of what goes on around us, rather than just take it all for granted. Because I know, as a young man, and I was relatively young in the 30s, so that I just took things for granted, and I found out that things didn't work out very happily for lots of people just around me. I wasn't thinking about the outside world, but I mean, here in my own communities, or that is in California, where I felt it was my home and community and should have been responsible for, I took everything for granted. And I just I hope that doesn't carry on into the 90s and the next century, actually, where people will be aware of what's happening. The 30s were the beginning of, as far as I was concerned, of the fact that the Americans are not exempt from problems at all, that we have to understand and accept and find some sort of solution for them. I mean, I know this sounds very utopian or something. I don't mean that. But I just feel the people that I met, for example, in the valley where the grapes of wrath were stored in that particular case, we were so unaware and so uncaring of our own people. I mean, I'm happy to see that today we're caring a little bit about what's happening in Somaliland or Somalia, but I do hope that we also can be considerate of our own people and planning more for the way we do it in the future.